Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues across this House for their participation today and indeed their expressions of support for this private member's bill, the 39th Amendment of the Constitution, Remote Parliamentary Voting Bill 2020. Thank you also to Minister for Chambers for being here this afternoon, and indeed for the encouragement and support of the National Women's Council and also Women for Election, whom I know are supportive of this piece of legislation. As we know, the current Article 1511(1) of the Constitution reads that all questions in each House shall, save as otherwise provided by this Constitution, be determined by a majority of the votes of the members present and voting, other than the chairman or presiding member. In the bill before us today, a new proposed Article 1511(4) is created in the following way, having deleted that section, that each House may make its own rules and standing orders, providing for special limited circumstances where members not present in that House may vote when any matter or class of matter as so provided for is to be determined by a vote of that House. So the private members is a constitutional amendment that removes the requirement to be present for every vote and enables each House of the Oireachtas to include in its standing orders a mechanism by which members could vote remotely or by proxy in limited and specified circumstances to be determined by the Houses of the Oireachtas themselves. Moving this provision from the constitutional rules to the rules of these Houses also has the advantage of being flexible over time, allowing for the Houses to make periodic changes to those rules over the decades to come to account for evolving situations that we may not be able to foresee today. However, there are situations today that we can and absolutely do foresee and indeed have experienced. There are at least 3 foreseeable situations in which a member of the Houses of the Oireachtas should be permitted, in my view, to vote remotely or by proxy. The first and most obvious is the public emergency situation, such as the experience we've just emerged from. A public health emergency, one like we've never seen before. An emergency in which shared physical presence became the antithesis, in fact, of public service. The second foreseeable scenario is illness or becoming immunocompromised, where a member must take physical time away from their parliamentary duties for certain and specific reasons. For example, a member may find themselves immunosuppressed or indeed deeply unwell for a period of time, and either through the long-term illness or medical treatment that results from that illness, the member may lose their ability to participate in parliamentary votes through no wish of their own, but only through a historical failure to have made inclusive provision for them. And we've had some examples of that over time, and indeed among our colleagues in the 33rd Dáil. It's obviously not for me to name them or to name any experience, but I'm sure other members will be aware of the natural life issues that face everyone in the working environment in here, just as much as they do in the working life outside Leinster House. It's also important to say that this provision may enable a broader representation in these Houses from persons with seen and unseen disabilities who may otherwise be perfectly able to participate in our national parliament, but who may need the additional supports that this provision may provide from them from time to time. The ability to participate differently is a proportionate and appropriate measure for us to be able to provide those who need to live a life differently or with additional supports, and we have not as a House done enough to be as inclusive as I believe we can be. The third foreseeable situation is, of course, maternity and paternity leave. People have babies. It's not a surprise, it should not be a surprise, but yet our working structures take no account of it in this House. It automatically shuts off women of this land that we haven't really even considered them as equal natural participants in these Houses by providing for the most natural of life's events. Obviously, this was particularly relevant at the time of the introduction of this bill into the House on the 8th of December 2020, when my Fine Gael colleague, the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, had announced her pregnancy just 3 days before. The first woman sitting at cabinet level in Ireland to take maternity leave. And although it was facilitated in terms of her ministerial brief, essentially a sticky plaster was used in terms of the Minister's attendance for voting in the Dáil, in terms of her concurrent parliamentary duties. And I have seen comment, from those who may feel that this is a self-serving bill, that it's politicians looking after themselves in some way. Perhaps let me say this, from my own perspective, I think I know in my own heart at this stage I won't need to avail of the maternity leave provision at this point in my career. I certainly hope not to need sick leave or to ever see another public emergency in that way. But we don't legislate for ourselves, we legislate for those who come next and for the broader societal issues more generally. And the lack of equivalent to maternity or paternity leave for representatives of the people is an impediment to a family-friendly and gender-sensitive working environment for members and for the community of the Houses of the Oireachtas who see us and indeed visit here and participate with us in committees and civic society participation more broadly. And that issue was considered in great detail by the Forum on a Family-Friendly and Inclusive Parliament, chaired by former TD Mary Upton, presented to the Ceann Comhairle in November 2021. And I want to acknowledge the work of my parliamentary colleagues on that body of work: Deputy Neil Richmond, Deputy Holly Cairns, Senator Fiona O'Loughlin, who's chair of the Women's Caucus, Senator Lisa Chambers and Senator Fintan Warfield, who worked on this, and of course the Ceann Comhairle Seána Farrell, who established the forum in the first instance. And the forum states that maternity leave is a more obvious issue now that more women are putting themselves forward for election and indeed getting elected, a natural consequence of having introduced gender incentive legislation. And of course that proportion is going to go up even more. We should have done it before now, but it's an absolute imperative at this stage. And of course there have been 2 private members' bills that attempted to introduce maternity leave by Deputy Sean O'Farrell, as he was then in 2013, and by Deputy Niamh Smith and Deputy Anne Rabbitte, as she was then in 2018. And I know from having spoken with some of the sponsors of those bills that essentially they got stuck on the question of voting and the constitutional requirements in relation to that. The forum also acknowledged, and I think this is really important, that in 2021 there were 2 instances of pairing arrangements to cover 2 6-month periods of maternity leave for members of these houses. The forum noted that in both cases it was the other female members who offered to enter into that arrangement, which is great but has the effect of further reducing the number of women who are actually voting in Parliament. It was also noted by the forum that members who had offered this arrangement had then found themselves facing criticism for having failed to vote on certain occasions. And it's that dependence on informal or indeed more formal pairing arrangements that I believe is an insufficient response at this stage in the evolution of the Parliament and our democracy. It creates uncertainty generally. It's uncertain for the member who is on leave. It has created problems for the person who offered to help, and it really cannot be depended on in perpetuity in a modern Parliament. I believe it's not a sophisticated enough response for a modern Parliament, and we need to take steps to address it, being as we are on notice of the problem and being committed to the expansion of female representation in the Chamber. However, one of the things that heartened me most about the forum's response was their analysis also of paternity leave and their acknowledgement that we must normalise this leave for men, as we are trying to in this House, as we are trying to do in broader society. Childcare is not only a female issue, childcare is a parent's issue. And there are a number of male members of these houses who have had little babies in their families in the lifetime of the 33rd Dáil. And I often wondered throughout that whether it was really honestly necessary for them to have to be in the convention centre or in this chamber at 9 and 10, 11, 12 and 1 a.m. each week as we voted on the business of that week, or whether for the first few months of the baby's life everyone might have been a little better served, including their constituents, had they had the opportunity and been facilitated to vote remotely and provide more support and company at home for a specified and limited period, but at such a tender stage of family life. I also want to address the question, of legal necessity in relation to this bill, because I'm aware of, and indeed I greatly respect, views outside of the constitutional academics that question whether this is necessary or whether it can be achieved through another route. And the reality is, I'm afraid, that we have received legal advice on 2 separate grounds and on 3 occasions. Firstly, the Houses of Oireachtas and indeed members were advised that the Article 15 requirement to be present and voting was absolute. That was the experience that we had as members at the beginning of the pandemic. I received that advice myself in the development of this bill, and I note that the forum also comments that it received equivalent advice in relation to the nature of the necessity to be present and voting. The forum also then went a different way about it and considered the question of employee rights and the intersection of employee rights with maternity and paternity rights. But in the words of the forum's report at page 24, the forum sought legal advice as to the employment legal advice provided, and the employment legal advice provided confirmed that Oireachtas members are not considered employees as such, and as a result may not avail of certain employee rights and protections as they would as their constituents would in other working environments outside these houses. So, as a priority recommendation, the forum states that there should be a referendum to address remote working and proxy voting in these houses. I want to acknowledge that there is legal debate about this, and I share the enthusiasm for constitutional development and interpretation more broadly, but the straight facts of working as a member of this House is that we have to act within the legal advice to continue to enjoy the presumption of constitutionality, and it just isn't available to act outside that, and it is advice in any event with which I personally agree. It is, of course, a provision in other parliaments to facilitate remote and proxy voting, and it has become more common as a consequence of the pandemic. Remote voting is reasonably common in Spain for the reasons I mentioned above. Romania has introduced electronic voting, as did the EU Parliament, as did the European Parliament, as well as Poland. It has proved more difficult in Westminster-style parliaments, but even in the UK, it was introduced as a trial run in January 2019, and following 2 extensions, it was made permanent. Proxy voting made permanent in the case of maternity leave, and there are now calls to extend that to include sick leave. But whatever mechanism we use, whether it's full leave, remote leave, proxy vote, proxy participation, or some combination of those, what we need to ensure as we move into the next stage, if this bill progresses and if it is successful at a referendum, and if we do end up in a situation of the Houses of the Oireachtas making arrangements for members for the future, we cannot be too prescriptive for members. We have to make sure that we don't that the choice is determined by the actual member, that they are facilitated to make the best choice for them and their own circumstances, both in early parenthood and in terms of their own assessment of what they want to do in terms of their work. But there's no question that at every turn, in every analysis, the ability to participate in votes remotely or by proxy is the first hurdle to overcome, and that hurdle is grounded in the current constitutional provision. If the constitution change moves through this House and is supported, and if it is put to a referendum, I look to say at the outset, I've never envisaged that this be a standalone event. It was always the case that this referendum was never going to be appropriate or suitable during a pandemic period, and naturally, to facilitate the best running of parliamentary democracy and democracy more generally, you don't want to have referendums that are sticking out on their own, for no good reason to ask people to come to vote on that. There is a natural confluence with the work being done with the Committee on Gender Equality, established as a consequence of the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, of which I am a member, of which Deputy Batchik is chair, and she's here today. That committee is working specifically at the direction of the Citizens' Assembly on 3 referendums related to gender equality, and it seems like a natural friend that this referendum might sit along 3 referendums such as that at some point in the future. So there's no need to take it out on its own, but perhaps to consider it in the round. But what I envisage, if it were passed and if it did get the support of the Irish people to make this change, that it's then a matter for the Houses of the Oireachtas to consider this type of votes or the types of class of votes, the types of scenarios that are included and not included, the periods for which that might be appropriate or not appropriate, the mechanism by which a member might apply formally, what they might expect in relation to that, and indeed provision for making changes to those rules over time. But I think, as we all sit here, and I know many of you support this bill, and I thank you for that, but I'm all too aware again how much further we have to go to really achieve true representation in this, our representative chamber. Whether it's more women, whether it's more people with disabilities or younger people who perhaps just don't see politics as an option that they can juggle alongside the potential of having a young family. It's our job now to think about those who will come after us and to make every provision possible to allow for a larger number of people to seriously consider this job as one that they can do and also have a family and to be available to them at those most tender moments. We must show that the practical realities of life outside Leinster House apply in here too. Otherwise, how are we to attract a broader group of representatives to our representative chamber? I look forward to the debate and commend the bill to the House. Thank you.
Before proceeding, I just want to bring a couple of things to the attention of the members. The Minister, the Government and Proposer must have a right to reply at 6:07. We have already 4 speakers over the listed space, over the space, if everyone was to take their full time. So I suggest that maybe people might consider sharing, in which case we get everybody in. The next speaker, now the Minister for State has the option of replying, of making his position here now or at the end, or equally have a shorter space to do it now. And we will try and guide as many people through as possible. Is that agreed? You want to speak now? You want to speak now, yes. And you have 15 minutes now, or you can take a lesser amount and you can share.
I'm sharing with Deputy Lawless.
Deputy Lawless?
Yeah. Thanks, Cathaoirleach, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak on the bill before the House this evening, and I'd like to thank and commend Deputy Carol McNeill for introducing this bill to the House. This bill seeks to amend Article 15 of the Constitution to allow both the House of the Oireachtas to put into standing orders circumstances under which members could vote remotely. It is very timely that we are debating this issue now. Firstly, because we've seen firsthand the effect the pandemic has had over the last 2 years on the workings of the Oireachtas, and secondly, because as a collective we are currently looking at initiatives that could bring about a more family-friendly and inclusive Parliament. The issue of remote voting is, of course, an important part of that conversation. Over the past 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact here in Ireland and indeed on societies and economies across the globe. We know that it is still with us, but thanks to sacrifices made by people over many months, the strength of solidarity among communities across the country and through the intervention of science with effective vaccines, we can hope that the worst is over and that the pandemic's impact is receding. However, similar to other pandemics in the past, COVID-19 leaves in its wake societal, economic, political and cultural changes that will last far beyond that pandemic itself. As policymakers, we have to acknowledge this and plan for new dynamics in our personal and working lives that are now becoming a reality. Deputy Carol McNeill's bill fits right into this conversation in terms of changes in how we work here in this House. The use of technologies for remote working have been with us for many years now, but none of us realised that physical meetings will be completely replaced by virtual ones. It never occurred to us that significant decisions could be made without having to meet face to face. It has also made us realise how efficient virtual meetings can be, as the need for travelling to and from meetings and indeed commuting from home to the workplace is no longer always necessary. It has also had many other positive benefits in terms of issues such as childcare and other caring responsibilities. The pandemic has led to a seismic shift in how we now view our working lives. For many people and businesses, remote working or a form of blended or hybrid working is becoming a mutually beneficial work model which can lead to a better choice for workers and increased productivity, and the government fully recognises this. The programme for government contains several commitments on the topic of remote working. Remote work is already a key consideration in the National Economic Plan, the Climate Action Plan, the Town Centre Living Initiative and the Smarter Travel Policy. The Government is committed to increasing remote work adoption in Ireland through removing barriers, developing infrastructure, providing guidance, raising awareness and leading by example in this area. The Government's remote work strategy, published in January last year, built on the progress made in the adoption of remote work over the COVID-19 crisis period. The strategy sets out plans to strengthen the rights and responsibilities of employers and employees, to provide the infrastructure to work remotely, and set out clear guidance on how people can be empowered to work remotely away from the employer's premises. A key part of the strategy is a legislative framework, and last month the Taoiseach Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment published a general scheme of the Right to Request Remote Working Bill 2022. The legislation will set out a clear framework to facilitate remote and blended working options insofar as possible. The bill will give every employee the right to request remote working from their employer. It will ensure that when an employer declines a request, there are stated reasonable reasons for doing so, and that conversations with workers will take place in a structured way. It will give employers and workers legal clarity on remote working, which became the default for many during the pandemic. It has to be acknowledged that remote working will not be for everyone or for every organisation or workplace, and a balanced issue to this issue is required. It will, however, ensure that there are better choices and options available for people. The legislation is a key part of the Government's spring legislative programme. Work is also underway around delivering a blended working in the civil service. A policy document was published last July, and the goal is to deliver a blended working policy that provides flexibility to both employees and employers in a manner that supports the continued delivery of high-quality services to the public and to businesses, while at the same time providing employees with choice and opportunity. So what does all this mean for members of the Oireachtas? We know that the way we work changed over the last 2 years. The requirement for social distancing led to an increased use of virtual meetings, and it has ongoing benefits. The Business Committee of the Dáil, which meets every Thursday to order the business of this House, continues to meet virtually, and I think members of that committee would agree that the use of virtual meetings is a great to support the most efficient use of members' time. The pandemic has brought into sharp focus an issue that has been discussed for a long time in Leinster House, that of a more family-friendly Parliament. All of us who have the privilege to work here representing our constituents would recognise that it is somewhat an atypical workplace, with working hours that make work-life balance challenging, particularly for those members with young children, with other caring responsibilities, and those who live far from Leinster House. And I would like to congratulate the Forum on a family-friendly and inclusive Parliament and its chair, former Deputy Mary Upton, for producing an excellent report in November of last year, which puts forward many recommendations on how we might achieve the goal of a more family-friendly and inclusive Parliament. And some of the recommendations echo the proposals in the private members' bill we are discussing here today. I'm very pleased in recent days to be able to implement one of the recommendations of the report, which was to better align the Dáil calendar with school holidays. Following on from a request from the Count Corla and with the agreement of the Business Committee, I've amended the Dáil calendar so that the Easter break, for example, in the Dáil aligns with the school Easter holidays. And I understand that a steering group is being put together to work on the overall implementation of the recommendations in this report, and I would encourage all members to support this important initiative. One of the most difficult issues that needs to be addressed for Oireachtas members is that of maternity leave, paternity leave and sick leave. The report from the Forum highlights the fact that these issues are of significant impediment to a family-friendly, inclusive and gender-sensitive working environment for members. Similar concerns were addressed in the report of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, published in June of last year, which recommended including maternity, paternity and parental leave available to all elected representatives, including ministers, and to provide flexible working options, including remote working and voting, and adjusting meeting times and rules to suit caring responsibilities. The Government has committed in the programme for Government to develop supports and alternatives for Oireachtas members to take parental leave. My colleague Minister Gorman recently met with members of the Irish Women's Parliamentary Caucus to get their view on how the provision of maternity leave for members of the Oireachtas would operate. There will be a further engagement with the Oireachtas members on the matter over the coming weeks and months to see how best these issues can be addressed, and I look forward to the outcome of these discussions. If I can now turn to the specifics of the bill before us this evening. In introducing this bill, Deputy Carol McNeill had in mind that remote working would greatly assist those members on maternity, paternity or sick leave being able to participate in the legislative process. The bill, in accordance with Article 46 of the Constitution, seeks to amend Article 15 of the Constitution to provide for each House of the Oireachtas to put into its standing orders circumstances under which members could vote remotely. At present, the Constitution does not allow for the Oireachtas to sit or vote remotely. Article 15(1)(3) of the Constitution envisages that the House of the Oireachtas will sit in or near Dublin, but that the Oireachtas can sit in such other place as they may determine, which is under to mean another physical location. Article 15(11)(1) provides that all questions in each House shall be determined by a majority of the votes of the members present and voting other than the Chairman. This is understood as requiring the physical presence of members. This constitutional provision led to the development of innovative solutions to ensure that the Oireachtas could continue to do its work and that votes could be taken during the pandemic, whilst ensuring the safety of the parliamentary community. I would once again like to thank the Oireachtas service for all their hard work in keeping both houses up and running in two separate locations, while at the same time keeping everyone safe. Of course, this was not the only Parliament that had to tackle the issues of members having to be present to vote. I noted with interest a report by the Oireachtas Library and Research Service from April 20, which stated that remote working was the most challenging parliamentary procedure that most parliaments had to deal with during the pandemic. Countries such as the UK, Austria, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Finland and Israel all required their members to be present and voting. The solutions found by other parliaments were similar to those of the Oireachtas, with the use of remote meetings where possible, reduced footfall within Parliament buildings and agreement amongst all members on reduced voting. And I note that the report of the Forum on a family-friendly and inclusive Parliament also recommends that Article 15 of the Constitution be amended. The Deputies' Private Members' Bill aims to address remote voting by amending Article 15(11) of the Constitution with the insertion of a new subsection 4, which states, "Each House may make its own rules and standing orders, providing for special and limited circumstances in which members of the House concerned who are not present in that House may vote when any matter or any class of matter so provided for is to be determined by a vote of that House." This is a complex matter and one that will require significant thought. Any changes to Article 15(11) in terms of remote voting or any wider changes allied to that in terms of remote working would also need to take into account other provisions of the Constitution. Article 15(1)(3) of the Constitution envisages that the House of the Oireachtas will sit in or near Dublin or in such a place as they may determine, which is understood to mean a physical location. I'll be concluding now. We have to examine how this would fit into a scenario where members are participating virtually. Following on from the constitutional requirement to be physically present in a physical structure, how would virtual participation work with 1512 of the Constitution, which provides for utterances in the House being privileged? Finally, we must also ensure in an overall way that the much-needed introduction of family-friendly policies is balanced with the constitutional obligation under Article 16 that Dáil Éireann be composed of members who represent constituencies determined by law. These are all matters that need to be examined and analysed closely, and are the questions that have been discussed in these chambers for a long time now. The pandemic has shown us that when something has to be done, it can be done. We have a great opportunity now to work together to identify and to provide the longer-term solutions that will make the Oireachtas a more family-friendly and inclusive Parliament. This, in turn, will hopefully encourage more people to participate in political life. The Government, as we've stated before, is not opposing this bill, and I again sincerely congratulate Deputy Carol McNeill for proactively proposing this bill and providing an opportunity and a focus for addressing this issue as part of the overall discussion on this agenda. And I look forward to hearing all deputies present and their views and debating this important matter further in the context of the legislation provided.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy James Lawless.
Thank you, Cahirdach.
Thank you,
Cahirdach. And Royal President speaking tonight, indeed. I welcome the bill and I want to commend Deputy Carol McNeill for bringing it forward, and I'm glad the Government is indeed supporting it, as the Chief Whip has outlined. I think it's a very important bill, and I think what the bill does is puts beyond doubt the availability of remote voting and remote participation should it be passed through a referendum, etc. I think that is a very necessary and crucial part of our response to the recent pandemic and to other matters, and indeed the Deputy has well described the family-friendly situations that may be assisted through legislation of this type and this kind of arrangements. And I suppose I'd say the Deputy has spoken about small babies. Even if someone whose babies are no longer small, coming in at 1 a.m. in the morning on a regularly on a midweek at night is not necessarily welcome or conducive to good household management. So I think it goes across the board. But I think those measures are very well described by the Deputy and very important. The other point I want to focus on as the Deputy said, there was some legal debate on what the requirements actually say at present and what was interpreted at the time within the Oireachtas, and I want to commend the Oireachtas for its flexibility and management of the pandemic, but I do think that there may have been ways that the existing provisions could have been interpreted somewhat differently to allow this kind of activity to take place. As the Chief Whip has outlined, the constitutional provisions in terms of Article 15.13 and Article 15.11, I think it is, in terms of deputies being present and voting, and in terms of the Oireachtas meeting in Dublin or some other place. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that other place must be a physical place. It doesn't say it must be, apart from the word Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, anywhere else is not prescribed. And there is some academic debate that a place could be a virtual place, and the internet is indeed a place. If there was a requirement to be physical, which is not in the text of the Constitution, a server farm or a hosting facility is a physical place, and the IP network is a physical place. But suffice to say that there's significant discussion on that point, and I think a place could be interpreted as being a virtual place. I want to acknowledge the work of people like Kieran Tolan, Senior Counsel, and his Constitutional Reform Group, who have done some significant academic endeavours into this. And it was what they would speak to as the purpose of interpretation to the Constitution in terms of what did the Founding Fathers envisage when they were framing these provisions. They envisaged it would be secure, it would be safe, it would participate, involve representatives from all over the country, talk to Dáil messengers to the House. There's nothing to suggest that they intended it would be done in one physical sitting at one place. And I think that if we take that purpose of interpretation, I think we can see the arguments that they make. The other point I would make in terms of that is that, and Dr. Sean O'Connell, another noted academic, has spoken about this, the Irish version of the Constitution, which takes precedence in the event of any conflict, is Ricada oit ella. Wherever else, loosely translated, and wherever else, again, is even less prescriptive in terms of being open to interpretation, being open to flexibility. But as I say, this referendum, if this bill is indeed passed, puts it beyond doubt. It is notable that many other institutions have already embraced such remote decision-making, and the courts, that other arm of the state, another branch of the separation of powers, has already embraced it with gusto, and there have been at this stage probably hundreds if not thousands of High Court decisions ordered, made and ruled over the last 2 years, and to my mind not challenged, certainly not in any credible and certainly not in any successful way. It's also a fact that the Cabinet has met in an incorporeal fashion, I think probably for many years now, and that continues to take place, notwithstanding the constitutional provisions around it. So I think, put simply, remote participation is to be encouraged, is to be welcomed. I'm unconvinced that we actually need to change the laws to do it, but let's do it if it helps to get that clarity and foundation to enable it to happen. It's a very important bill. I commend the Deputy for bringing it forward, and I certainly support its intent and its detail. Thank you.
We have to recalibrate as well now, because we have 5, 6, 7 and 9 speakers. So I think in order to try to get everybody in, everybody will have to try to put as much as possible and share as much as possible. 3 minutes after 3 minutes, I think, keep an eye on it.
Okay.
I can't do anything about that because I'm
no problem. Well, I was going to propose that I share my time with Deputy Higgins, but if it's 3 minutes, I shall endeavour to use 3 minutes. Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and I commend Deputy Carol McNeill for the introduction of this bill, which is an eminently sensible solution to a constitutional problem. And I actually do note, and I thank Deputy Lawless for making the point that the Irish version of the Constitution actually takes precedence, and it is far less prescriptive in relation to where, and I think the where is important, as a debate did ensue when we were relocated to the convention centre as to what where meant. You know, could it be a constituency office, for instance? We have to come up with reasonable solutions to what is an eminently resolvable issue, and I think that Deputy Carol McNeill's proposal does just that. I'm reminded, and reading her first stage speech, as I did this afternoon in preparation for this particular debate, you know, it became increasingly obvious that I can think of literally 24 members of the House in my 11 years who would have and undoubtedly could have availed of such a provision if it were law. I'm thinking of at least 2 members that I can recall who themselves have had babies, Deputy Smith and Minister McEntee, quite a number of deputies, including 2 present that I'm aware of, who've become fathers while members of the House, including myself, and indeed a member absent, Deputy Dillon. And I can think of many occasions where, as my colleague Deputy Lawless mentioned, it wasn't exactly conducive to a family-friendly parliament. In fact, I recall the Ceann Comhairle made a big deal out of it. The fact that a well-known newscaster had made a point about family-friendly being the focus of the Oireachtas, and we were voting on our weekly divisions at 2:33 a.m. And how ironic it was. But there were many occasions where I think members would very much appreciate the opportunity in a secure manner, under certain circumstances, as the Deputy outlined in her bill, where we could press a button, vote, or indicate visually to other members. We have enormous televisions for the benefit of people at home. We have enormous televisions in this chamber, which are eminently visible to all of us, and I'm sure other provisions could be made to ensure that the security of the vote is never questioned. But I'm also thinking of members who've injured themselves. Minister Naughton and Madigan, for instance, in this term, in this Dáil, I should say, have injured themselves where it might not have been possible for them to leave their home, but they could have participated and or voted. And indeed, Deputy Naughton and Deputy Cannon, who's present, have had very serious injuries in the very recent past, where after a period of convalescence, they probably would have been able to participate and or vote if they wanted to. And I think it's imperative that we take the lead of the European Parliament. I had a reason to participate, actually, or rather to sit and watch a debate in the European Parliament, and it was very evident that there were members all over Europe participating in parliamentary debates in Brussels via secure link. And I'm not sure whether they voted. I think they probably indicated their preference on issues during the course of a particular debate. And I do think that that is something that we can achieve. As the Deputy has outlined quite rightly, this couldn't be a standalone referendum, but it is an opportunity for us to put together a number of, I would call them minor suggestions, not that this is minor, but there are minor questions that I think the public would be encouraged to support, and this is most likely one of them. There's a number of others. I recall in the programme for government back in 2011 a thorough debate, as I'm sure the Chair will recall, about having a referendum day to update our constitution, and that included in particular, and probably most importantly, the reference to women's place being in the home, which for 11 years we have let fester as a government, and I'm never happy with it because there's been lots of opportunities for us to undo it, but we haven't. Perhaps this is an opportunity for us to put something, to have a referendum on something really of substance and really important, to which this referendum would lend itself, because it's about family-friendly Parliament. It's about treating women as equals. It's about ensuring that members of the House can actually participate and/or vote when it is deemed appropriate by the Houses themselves, for which this House determines anyway. And I think that that is possible. So I'll share my time, as the clock indicates, with Deputy Higgins. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Emer Higgins. We'll take 5 per member until we see how things go.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Cahir. I appreciate the clarification.
It is.
I want to start by first thanking Deputy Jennifer Carroll McNeill for all of her work on this and for bringing this bill before the House. I think the fact that it has such strong cross-party support is really welcome, and it's really good to see. And that speaks to the fact that this legislation is really common sense legislation that would make life in politics more inclusive and more family friendly, and more flexible too in terms of adapting to emergency situations when they arise. This is a particularly important bill for women. The lack of provision around maternity and family leave can be off-putting for young women considering a career in politics. And as Deputy Carroll McNeill has outlined, the bill would provide for a proxy parliamentary voting system to formally allow various types of leave, including maternity, parental and adoptive leave, a provision which we definitely need. Only recently we were forced to look at this matter, and the fact that no Cabinet Minister previous to Minister Helen McEntee had ever been pregnant in office really tells us all we need to know about how welcoming Irish politics is for young women who want to start a family. I hope that this bill will encourage a conversation and start a process of significant and positive change to improve our parliamentary community. For so long now, we have witnessed very real barriers to consideration of a career in our national parliament. This bill was a key recommendation of the Forum on a family-friendly and inclusive parliament last year, which was initiated by our Ceann Comhairle. And it's a recommendation that will make life as a parliamentarian a more attractive, rewarding and accessible career option for people from every walk of life. I also think this is important given the challenges that we've faced in these past 2 years. It's vital that lessons are learned and that we equip ourselves properly for any potential future emergencies that might arise. And I think it's also important that any fears about this measure being abused should be alleviated by the fact that the bill would only provide for remote or proxy voting in very limited and specified circumstances. We need our Parliament to be more diverse than it currently is. We need our Parliament to be more flexible and more adaptable than it currently is. And I really welcome the role that this bill will play in improving parliamentary life on both those fronts. Cahir, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate my colleague Deputy Jennifer Carroll McNeill. Jennifer is an active member of the Women's Caucus, which is a great example of female parliamentarians coming together, leaving their politics at the door and utilising their time and uniting together in their cause for a diverse and inclusive parliament and for legislation that benefits women right up and down this country. Deputy Jennifer Carroll McNeill comes from a legal background, and I think it's fantastic to see her utilising her professional experience and her technical knowledge to bring forward such a progressive piece of legislation. Jennifer and I worked together for a while about a decade ago, and back then I can clearly remember her answer when someone asked her what her favourite book was. It was Bunreacht na hÉireann, the Irish Constitution. And that's why it's so special to see her today bringing forward legislation that may well pave the way to an amendment to that very constitution. Congratulations, Jennifer, well done.
Thank you. The next 2 deputies appearing on the list are Deputies Neil Richmond and Kieran Cannon. And we're staying well within time so far, so if you gentlemen are willing to share, it would be appreciated. Yeah.
More than willing to share, Cahir. Slightly concerned about what bedtime stories in the Carroll McNeill household contain, but very grateful to Deputy Higgins for that elusive comment. Cahir, I really sincerely welcome this bill and personally want to thank Deputy Carol McNeill for introducing it. Indeed, if it wasn't for a global pandemic, there is no chance I would have had any paternity leave with my second child. I distinctly remember leaving Holles Street for a vote in the Shannon 2 days after the birth of my first child. It wasn't much crack for me, the child, or indeed my wife. I still am regularly reminded of the factor. And this is where we goes to. Our democracy, quite frankly, Kieran, is not fit for purpose in terms of representative terms. There are far too many archaic barriers to ensuring this Parliament is truly representative of the entire society. This bill goes a small way to rectifying that, but I hope it is sincerely, as Deputy Farrell has mentioned, the start of a general approach to re-looking at how we do parliamentary democracy in this country, how we use the examples of other countries, but also how we use the opportunities and the lessons of the pandemic to produce a much better form of parliamentary democracy. I reference obviously the access to paternity leave and, far more importantly, maternity leave for members of the Oireachtas. But also I think what really requires due consideration is those who are perhaps requiring sick leave or who have become immunocompromised, and their ability to completely carry out their duties as members of the Oireachtas. I reference at this stage, Kieran, the case of Amy Callaghan, who is the Member of Parliament for East Dunbartonshire in Westminster for the Scottish National Party, who this week, against doctors' orders, has returned to Parliament in order that she can vote and speak on a piece of legislation. She is quite literally putting her life at risk as an immunocompromised person who suffered a very serious brain hemorrhage not so long ago in order to simply do her job. The fact is the Houses of Parliament were able to make changes in relation to maternity leave, but we have to see it through to make sure that these changes are fully encompassing. As Deputy Carol McNeill mentioned, I was one of the Oireachtas members who sat on the forum for a more family-friendly and inclusive Parliament. And over the course of a number of meetings, all held virtually, I'll add, under the very good chairpersonship of Mary Upton, a number of issues came out. And the report, I know it's been put in every member's pigeonhole at this stage, and I do hope everyone has a chance to read it. And I appreciate that some of the recommendations are probably very far-reaching, and some of them, I think there's 54 in total, probably aren't realistic. And it showed the dynamic of having a forum made up not just of parliamentarians, but people from the private sector, from the NGO sector, and society as a large. But there's some very obvious low-hanging fruit, and there's some very obvious wins, Kieran, that could make this democracy so much more inclusive and accessible. And I fundamentally believe the passage of this bill and the due course passage of a related referendum is one of those most obvious things. But I am taken, Kieran, slightly concerned that when an opinion poll was put up about this piece of legislation on one of the news sites, there was quite a bit of opposition to it. And the commentary that came down was the type of anti-politics and anti-democratic commentary that all of us have a responsibility, regardless of party, regardless if we agree with this legislation or not, to combat. And I think that goes to everything we do in this House, indeed these Houses, but it's something that is of major concern. I'll conclude, Kieran, referring to one semi-related point, and that's in relation to privilege. And one of the things that struck those of us who are members of the forum, and indeed I would hope all of us over the last number of months, is the situation at committees where we're all dialed into committee, but yet we have all had to travel into Leinster House in order to make use of privilege. It's absolutely farcical. It needs to be changed. It should be changed. I think it would give a far greater ability for TDs and senators, particularly those from outside Dublin, unlike myself, to actually participate in committee meetings on a Tuesday and be able to gain those precious 4 hours or indeed 24 hours with their family at home. In conclusion, Kieran, I absolutely commend this bill. I look forward to supporting it through the stages, and more importantly, I look forward to campaigning in a referendum to have this passed very, very soon.
Thank you. Deputy Kieran Cannon.
I also want to commend Deputy Carol McNeill for bringing forward this far-seeing piece of legislation that seeks to amend our constitution and ultimately change the way we do things in this building so that we become a far more family-friendly workplace. I've been fortunate, deeply fortunate, to have been walking in those gates to Leinster House for 15 years now. It's an extraordinary privilege to be able to do so, to represent the people of Galway East, to air their views and their aspirations for the Ireland that they aspire to. And we never lose sight of that. I don't think any one of us in this House ever lose sight of what an extraordinary privilege it is. But 15 years ago, I had a 10-year-old son who's now 25, very happy. But there's no question that my relationship with him suffered in those 15 years as a result of the work practices within this building. And I can only imagine, and I do feel in the last number of years, those work practices have become even less family friendly and continue to pile even more pressure on all of us who work within this Parliament. So I do think that this bill not alone gives us cause to reflect on the very specific changes that need to be made to our constitution to make this place a far more family-friendly workplace, but it also begins, it should maybe force us into questioning what other aspects of this workplace make it so unfriendly to being parents, to being carers for those who matter to us in our lives. And when we introduced gender quotas a number of years back, it was a very, very welcome development in terms of making this House and indeed the other House a far more diverse place, far more representative of Irish society as a whole. But I always felt that it wasn't the far-reaching solution that we needed to see in order to ensure that we would see that kind of diversity in Leinster House. It is part of the solution. But I do fundamentally believe that you could throw open the gates of Leinster House tomorrow morning to people from all walks of life. But once they had an opportunity to talk to anybody who actually works in this place for perhaps a couple of hours, they might think twice about pursuing a career in politics. So that's ultimately what we have to look at here, is how do we ensure that anybody who is contemplating a life in politics, a life of public service, a life of democratic representation, feels they are going into a place that is friendly, family-friendly, and conducive to having good, strong, healthy relationships with those people who matter in our lives. So this is a really, really important, and I would argue groundbreaking piece of legislation from Deputy Carol McNeill that forces us to ask those questions of ourselves and ask ourselves what do we need to do to ensure that that kind of change happens. At the end of what has been an extraordinarily challenging time for our country in terms of the pandemic, and as we return to normal, I do think it's very, very important that as we do that, we question what aspects of normal are actually worth returning to. And I think if all we do is turn the page and return to 2019 and things continue on as they did before, I think we'll have lost the opportunity to learn an awful lot of very, very valuable lessons as to how things were done during that time. And we did press the fast-forward button, I would argue, on how exactly we can shape our workplaces for the future. Remote working became part of all our lives, but those of us who work within this place, and indeed for many thousands of more who work elsewhere. So I do think that, again, we should lead by example. We should look at opportunities, as many have suggested, in allowing for participation in this parliamentary process from remote locations. And perhaps it may not be as difficult as we think. Certainly the technology exists to do that. And if you look at the example of other countries, and indeed as many have mentioned of the European Parliament itself, it successfully does that. So that can be the new normal. And those women and men who drafted our Constitution from 80 years ago, they never envisaged the world we live in right now in 2022. They never envisaged the opportunities that are presenting to us right now to create far more family-friendly workplaces, to create workplaces that people would ultimately find attractive. So I think this is a very, very special moment in the life of our houses of the Oireachtas when we look to establish a workplace that is that family-friendly and conducive to being normal, active, participative members of society. So I commend Deputy Carol McNeill, and I look forward to seeing the remaining elements of this legislation passing as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Now, Deputies Ivana Bacik and Igor Snodig will share the final 10 minutes.
Good last count, Corla, and delighted to have the chance to speak on this important bill and want to commend Deputy Carol McNeill on her initiative in bringing it forward. I think it's really important that we're debating this. It's very timely, and it's really good to hear the very honest contributions to the debate from men and women who've spoken. And I should say that when I was first elected to these houses in 2007 to the Seanad, I was pregnant with my second daughter, and it was shocking to me how difficult it was to accommodate a baby within these precincts. And I was very grateful to the women members who'd gone before me on whose initiative a creche had been established, a creche which I was, after some difficulty, I was able to access, and which was, hugely helpful. It meant I could run over and breastfeed a small baby and contribute to Shannon debates part-time in those early months when you really want to be spending as much time at home as possible, but at the same time as an elected representative where there was no provision of maternity leave, there was an imperative also to be contributing. So, this bill I would see in an important part of a whole package of measures that are necessary to modernise our Parliament, as the Deputy has said herself, but also to make it more inclusive, more friendly towards women, towards men with caring responsibilities, more family friendly and more flexible. And it's timely because, of course, as we're coming through the pandemic, all of us have learned the benefits of remote working. All of us are navigating that process of trying to facilitate more working from home. And when we're seeing that debate taking place in workplaces more generally, it's very important that we in the House of the Oireachtas should lead by example also and seek to facilitate remote working. And it is unfortunate, I think, that it will require apparently a constitutional amendment to do so. And certainly speaking with colleagues like Deputy Brendan Howlin, who long experience of Dáil procedure, he says it should be very practical to allow for committees to conduct hearings remotely and to continue to do so. And we're doing it already, but there is this strange anomaly, it seems, where we can participate in committee meetings remotely from our offices, but not from outside the precincts. And I live 10-minute cycle from here, from Leinster House in Dublin Bay South, my own constituency, but I can't participate remotely in a committee meeting from my home office, whereas I can from the office here in the precinct. So I think there's anomalies that require addressing, and I think it's very important, therefore, that we bring this bill forward. And as others have said, this is also in keeping with recommendations that were made by Mary Upton's excellent Committee on Family-Friendly and Inclusive Parliament, and indeed with the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality. And I thank Deputy Carol McNeill for her reference to my work. I'm very proud and honoured to have been appointed as chairperson of the Oireachtas Special Committee on Gender Equality. And our remit, is to ensure the implementation of the 45 recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality. And one of those recommendations in particular, recommendation 23, relates to improving family-friendly practices for all representatives elected to public office. And indeed the Citizens' Assembly recommended flexible working options not just within Parliament but also at local authority level, and also recommended the making of maternity, paternity and parental leave available to all elected representatives, including ministers. And that again is long overdue, and I was glad in another role as Vice Chair of the Women's Caucus, along with Senator Fiona O'Loughlin, to meet with Minister O'Gorman very recently to hear his proposals for bringing forward maternity, paternity and parental leave for public representatives. So there's clearly a momentum behind these measures, and that's really important. And our Committee on Gender Equality will be putting forward very practical recommendations to government as to how to implement the Citizens' Assembly recommendations. And certainly, as Deputy Carol McNeill has said, among our recommendations will be, I think, how we bring forward those 3 recommendations for constitutional change to create a more inclusive constitution, a constitution that's updated and that provides for gender equality, provides for a more inclusive definition of family, and that will change the very sexist language about women's role and the role of mothers. And I think the amendment that Deputy Carol McNeill is proposing in this bill would be very much an integral part of a package of amendments to be put to the people in one day. And I think that would be a really good way of approaching this, not necessarily as a standalone amendment, but very much as an amendment that is about creating a more gender equal Ireland, an Ireland in which women have a more equal status, and in particular in which women are more facilitated, supported and encouraged in running for public office, because I think we shouldn't forget that our Parliament still looks very male, very stale and pale, and not as much as it was when I was first elected back in 2007, but certainly still very, very male. And I'm very struck on my election to the Dáil how different it is, with only 23% of our TDs female. We've got a 40% women's representation in the Seanad. Let's make the Dáil more representative of women, and let's bring forward a range of measures to do that.
Thank you.
Cormagad agus Cormagad den Tacta McNeill agus our Muikas gur hogtu an piece of rock the shock from Tosig, Tasha Tavaktuk, Marni Fade Linga hypocritical, nor Tomadig Ri, Octanans and Chaksha Agralish and Public Witten a Gorgadov Ahra Yanav Kundev Kinta de Nakwil Mana Hiesle Rilaka Maravi Nurtamid Toganistach Rakti to have Tish Mahork agus Tresha Sera the Tish Mahori Norta Pashti Nuako no Norta Fibana Own Norta Tashid Marhish Mahori Le Pashti no Norris Gadov Termi Kurama Yanav than a Tish Mahori no through than a Pashti. So Kai Midna Chak Susish and Quidella than Soki agus it's true Gwillan on major of unrocked at our Cork backgoring, Massam Hain Nakshin a via guest, better will Browler, so Nurata 5 and 9 and Bunrock Kaimid a Hogan Suskan data no Ahru no foil regulation quitchin a then a 5 and Togman and Desho con Mokogardis a Guala Violet and Win at our Posh the Newark a V and Shaw, Massam and Shockton Shakatan on Shockton River. Páiste nua ché an Balachadí Kilrush Golf Club. So it's meaning that I'm actually in show, Gemech Fibeown, in show, mar Neil mid, Agraha, Mar Institute, Gafred Daila Le, Guna, Sale, Tauki, Maraka, Horha, but Gakalinchkin. Rugamo, any Nurvimate, Blian Tuffa and show, Nearvain, Sira. Ahrachas, no Marachas, no ein rud a gist eganamse agus níor bhéin smuoine bheann faoi mar tagan brú leis den party mas party beag tú bheith arás na níor dúirtéin le numar arás mar mission whip so bhí min an arál an féin ní gad an bhein seo. But tagan an brú sin agus tagan sé ar gach duine, but tá sé níos éasca beidir I grúpaí mór agus thar na blianta mar whip gan mission denmh cínta de nuair a tháinig Tish Mahori Kogum La Pashti Oga, a glorag pairing, Gurev me, a Denavir Cleelishin, Kundenav Kintigul and Desh, a Tish Mahori Dolawala Esti, Nuravi and Chansagum, Niravan Chansagwing Agoni. August Tasha Kart Gavechman or shot, near hitting down as a Kayla. A Balakwan Balakella, Nuravi Medic Denav, Upper Ovalia, Lelingan Pandem. Agus beléir de gachtain a go raibh muid an or go cógamach muid an volta chahabh. Is féidir é dhéanamh I ngacala ré eile den down. Ní gach fechant na cólachtaí mór rúndan or na cólachtaí móra tá airige de có. Níor of crinethe board of directors ag na bancana bhí siad an volta chahabh glacham leis. No bhí lehéidí an UN agus líní mar sin. Just caithí tú then if Daila leis an tralavata awn an ish chun Westland go mech gacus slán. Smaoinige mar a dúirt massam an tachta Farrell de mech an scálan sin bris sús agus siúd atá tain. Mar déitach a landín agus bhí daoine tain an seo nach raibh an freastal. Daoine ag fáil bás a bhí an seo nach raibh an freastal ar an dáil. Bacór go mech an deis a có más gá Volta chav ó las muid an institute seo, nó go mech daoine ag an seasamhisteach ar a son. Mas gá I Parliamentary tá liste ann nuair tá tú ag seasamh sa táchan liste mas gá Oireachtas go tucan duine eile isteach. Ar an córa mas gá de Oireachtas tá duine ag an eile is féidir teachtarsteach is féidir sort substitute a dhéanamh nó duine eile teach go gcomharba ort. Níl éon bailach a gcuinge. Níl tú sásta Oireachtas an séchan má tá tú a party beag nó má tá stró ar an cantar tuis go gailhrín party an séchan so tá an úlach breise ort bheithin seo. So tá sé seo ceart caiimiid an cuid practicúil a oibrú amach. So má táid ag dó go dtí an pobl ag glórag bhóta ar seo nach depa ar seo mar chuir sé sin séirmid. Hepú ar referan a bhí na parte a league beagnach tíh héirda ribh seo nuair chuig me go dtí an pobl. So caiimid denmh cinnte de go bhfuil na freigraí going go dtigamid conas mar oibríonn sé agus nachfuil sé chorás don sort an slí a cógameach daoine an seo ag catha bhóta ach an ámanna Eshkach túl, ámanna tá sí tain ámantas marachas nó tiismthorachta nó a lehéid. So takeíim leis agus tásúlagum gnéanfar boga ar go topic agus daile lena faibanna bunúsacha eile atá a chur gcuine daoine bheith an seo de gach inscin atá an bunreacht agus go mbeidh an bunreacht níos nua aimsir tuisc a lehéad a ahrú seo, but seo tús agus takeíim leis agus mas féidirling é cabhra áil chun go mbeidh sé tríd an dáil chu tapaí is féidir agus an son amach an sin leis an cuid eile den reachtaíocht do referendum atá teach takeíimid leis.
You have been very cooperative. Should be in a watch factory. It's perfect timing. So the government has 5 minutes. And then the proposal.
Gurmagat Cahirlock, and I want to once again thank Deputy Carol McNeill for proposing this bill, and it's been a very interesting debate, and I'd like to thank all the deputies for their contributions, and also a lot of the personal references and reflections of members who have been here many years, who I think have brought their own difficulties on how the Parliament and the Dáil as currently sits is not one that's inclusive or matched to one that we expect to attract as people. As Deputy Batchik mentioned, I think increased female participation is really important. I think all parties have an obligation to drive that forward, and we will see progress on that. I think in the next general election, we also have to make the workings of our Parliament far more inclusive in all aspects of our work, and I think many of the stories we've heard today show how it deters many people, I think, when they see the inner workings of here. But I think there is a cross-party approach now, good structures that the Count Corla has established to actually progress a lot of matters, and I think we're seeing the evolution of that today, which our own bill about Deputy Carol McNeill. So remote working is one element, I think, of a wider agenda, as I've said, on making the Oireachtas a more family-friendly and inclusive workplace. As has been mentioned already, in addition to the Deputies Bill, we have many recommendations regarding a forum on a family-friendly and inclusive Parliament, and from the Citizens' Assembly. And I know, and indeed the work of the new Special Oireachtas Committee on Gender Equality that Deputy Batchik is chairing will play an important role as well on seeing how we can mould those recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly into tangible policy outcomes. I think that it's important and positive that that's been progressed now. There are also commitments, strong commitments in the programme for government to develop supports and alternatives for Oireachtas members to take parental leave. Some, as I said, I referenced some progress on one of the recommendations with the Count Corla referenced around the aligning school holidays, which I know was a difficulty for many deputies and senators over a long period of time, where we didn't align the calendars, and that was very difficult for certain members. And as I've said, my colleague, the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration, Youth, has already started to progress discussions with members on how we might best improve family-friendly policies in these houses as well. It is clear that there is significant momentum behind the proposals for a more family-friendly and inclusive Parliament. Whilst these matters are complex and, as highlighted this evening, involve different competing constitutional obligations, I believe it is up to all of us to work together to come up with workable solutions which may or may not involve legislative or constitutional change. And as I've said, I look forward to future discussions on these issues raised in the legislation, and I thank Deputy Carol McNeill for her work and for progressing this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Carol McNeill.
Thank you, Cahirlock, and thank you, Minister Chambers, and indeed thank you to all deputies for coming and attending and participating in this debate. I greatly appreciate both your interest and your support and your contribution, and thank you in particular for the personal reflections that you bring to the House. It's not always an easy thing to do, to reflect on one's own experience, particularly in a forum like this, but it does help tell those stories about why it's important, and we tell the stories of our constituents, but in order to advance and evolve our own democracy, it's sometimes important to just reflect on the personal experiences that we've had, because there is absolutely no point in coming in and pulling up the ladder and pretending that it's easy to be here when it isn't. We need to be honest with people to say, you can do it too. We do it, we see these issues, we face the challenges, we get on and we try and fix them, but we do it anyway, and you can too. This is all about trying to bring in more people into this chamber, trying to be more inclusive and reaching out further and further. And we have had very, very good parliamentary structure. It has served us extremely well, but our democracy is essentially always incomplete. There's always more to do. There's always more that can be improved upon. It's naturally incomplete if half the population isn't represented in a reasonable way over time. Here, that has never been the case, and we need to take the steps that we can to get to that point. So, democracy and our institutions of democracy must keep pace with our need to reflect the will of our people and the things that are important to them. And where we find barriers, we must take steps to try to address them. And this is simply an effort to do that. I recognise how complex it is. I recognise the read across constitutionally. I recognise the academic debate around it, whether it's necessary, whether it's not, the read across on, the questions in relation to parliamentary privilege and how that's linked, and Deputy Howland mentioned that to me also, and it's of course part of the same conversation. And I suppose my effort is to try to begin to tackle that initial barrier, to say, well look, what at its core is it that we must be here for, that's perhaps a barrier to the maternity and paternity, the sick leave, and that is of course voting. I don't want any, I hope that nobody would take from this that I've somehow, don't see it as important to be here. Being here, standing here is the privilege of my professional career. Being here it's so enjoyable, it's such a privilege to be able to participate, to be able to vote, to be able to be part of the parliamentary structure, to be able to serve constituents. But at the same time, I recognise that for the institutions to evolve and to become stronger and better, and for more people to be able to come easily into those structures, they must be questioned and challenged and helped evolve as time goes on. And as Minister Chambers, as Deputy Batchik, as other deputies have said, Deputy Snuddick, these things must happen together. There's a confluence of events at the moment which require, as Catherine Day in the Citizens' Assembly said, real seismic change around some of these issues. There is that opportunity, but only if we take those points and run with them. I noted what Deputy Richmond mentioned in relation to the poll on the Journal, and it's interesting to see. Of course, it's easy to give a quick reaction to something like that, a quick question, are you in favour or against? But of course, what he was talking about was some of the comments in relation to it, and it is hard to to see some of those and to think that people might believe that we don't really want to do the work, or that we're not very, very, very happy to be here. Of course we are. It isn't about making life easier for politicians. It's about opening up the Parliament to more people and to making it easier for them to be here. It's about opening up rather than trying to protect or serve oneself. We have had separate conversations about the need for more female representation and very strong debates about that. There must be more women in politics. Women in politics must be facilitated. The debate around Minister McEntee and the particular challenges she faced as a Cabinet Minister. That's all very well, but then, when you bring these measures that might try to realise some of that ambition, and indeed when they're brought forward by women such as myself or Deputy Batchik as part of the committee, or Catherine Day as part of the Citizens' Assembly, rationally it's important that that those be supported or at least discussed in a serious way as steps, and that is the debate that we've had here. It is I so greatly welcome it, a really genuine genuinely positive debate about an idea that is an effort to be constructive. We will see how we can take it forward through committee stage. There is more debate to be had about the wording. I understand the complexity of that, the concerns around the Attorney-General, around the read across, about other things. Those are debates that we can have and we're open to having. But I thank the House and thank the members of the House for facilitating this debate and for participating and for being as encouraging and supporting as you have been. Thank you, Chair.